Welcome to the Gaze. I'm glad to be with you on a digital platform of New Europe, platform where we will show you all the significant events in different regions that at the end of the day affect the world globally. And we will speak about it with our experts for you, because it's a high time right now to decide the future of the international law and decide the future of peaceful global order. So today our guest is Maria Tomac, is the head of Crimean Platform support service. With her, we will discuss the future possibility of legal instruments to return Crimean Peninsula to Ukraine state and the future of Crimean Peninsula. Welcome. So, hello, Maria. Very glad to see you in our program.
Thank you for having me.
So I want to remind our audience that this year Kyiv hosts the third Crimean Platform Summit in a hybrid format, and on August 23rd, expert discussion of the Crimean Platform took place. On October 24th, 2023, the Parliamentary Summit of the Crimean Platform will take place in Prague, it's Czech Republic, for the second time. And I recall our audience that the Crimean Platform is an international consultation and coordination format initiated by Ukraine aimed at improving the effectiveness of the international response to the occupation of Crimea, responding to the growing security threats, increasing international pressure on Russia, preventing further human rights violation and protecting the victims of the Russian regime, and also the achievement of the main goal is the deoccupation of Crimea and its full return to Ukraine. So I would like to start our conversation with the information that during the second summit last year, Ukraine increased the number of participants in this platform and expanded the geography of participants, including the countries of African continent and so-called the other side of the Atlantic. So I want to ask you how it helps, according to the situation with African countries and with their double position towards Ukraine and towards Russian position at the war, how it helped the situation with the Crimea platform right now?
I would say that in these dramatic circumstances of the full-scale Russian aggression, it somehow helps Ukraine to reach out to the, I would say, non-Western countries, right? Because some people find this term Global South being like colonial or post-colonial, so therefore I would avoid this term. But still, I mean, if you look even in the voting at the UNGA, United Nations General Assembly, for the resolutions related to Ukraine and to Crimea precisely, you can see that the number of those countries, non-Western countries, who support Ukraine and holds this pro-Ukrainian position increased significantly. And how it helps, like the very easy answer is that it shows that Russia becomes more and more isolated. It's not only isolated with this aggressive attitude and violation of territorial integrity of Ukraine within Western countries that perceived to be kind of pro-Ukrainian or Ukraine is pro-Western in turn, but also among those countries who were very close to Russia since even 1960s, I would say. And in those countries, maybe I would go too much into details, but just to say that in those countries that are post-colonial, that were Western colonies, there's this strong attitude towards Russia, positive attitude, as anti-imperial force, which sounds ridiculous for Ukraine. And that's part of our efforts as well. We try to convey this message that Russia isn't anti-imperial, it's absolutely imperial, it's the last empire. And the aggressiveness of Russia shows this colonial. And Crimea, by the way, is a perfect case to show this, because now Russia is committing crime of colonization of Crimea. And it's not just, some words like to be very loud or to be very, impressive to impress the audience, but that's just the legal fact. Russia colonizes Crimea, and it cannot be anti-colonial. So to emphasize this within the whole world, not only within Western countries, which are perceived sometimes really negatively among those non-Western countries, is one of our aims. And of course, it's a sign of Ukrainian win, Ukrainian further victory, is the fact that we have like more and more countries who hesitating to show up with Russia like anywhere, like within various formats at the various countries, within various summits, et cetera. We still have a long way to go, but I think that Ukrainian work in these terms is really significant. It's about Crimean Platform summits, where we have African countries, Central American countries, countries from Persian Gulf, for instance, in this summit.
In regard with the situation of they're far away from the geographical position of Crimea, from the historical context of understanding what's going on between Ukraine and Russia during centuries, what can be, in the frames of Crimean Platform, their pragmatic interests that, except for the informational activities of our governments, of our diplomats, we can use to help them stand on our side more effective?
You know, I would argue about them being far away because in current global economy and globalism, you cannot be far away from anywhere. And the crisis with the grain, the food crisis shows this very well, that African countries who might not ever heard about Ukraine even, they're affected by the food crisis, by the fact that Russia is again committing this crime and deprives those countries that were consuming Ukrainian grain from getting the food. So I think that that's one of our key messages also, is that yes, we're like thousands of kilometers away, but that doesn't mean that you might not be affected by the war, by the full-scale invasion. Same with energy crisis, and wherever you go, for instance, we had a visit in the beginning of this year to Malaysia and Indonesia, and we have heard lots there about how these countries were affected, because when you have shortages with the grain, you have prices growing to various products, et cetera, so it's like this effect of snowball. So therefore, I think that this is one of the main arguments. But when it comes maybe to some values, I think that the issue of children is really something that makes people be sympathetic towards Ukraine, especially after the warrant arrest issued by the International Criminal Court. It's not, I mean, it's a court. Like, it's not some political statement or even not the UNGA or something like political, some political scene. It's a court, and it has very solid evidence of Putin and his allies committing this crime. And issue of children is really something vulnerable for like every human being probably, and also for African countries, because there are lots of children affected by various crises, like food crises and various crimes in that continent, but also in other parts of the world. So I think that's something. But also when it comes to some issues related to values, we have this concept which is undoubtable within the UN members of the United Nations, is the UN Charter. Russia violated UN Charter with the occupation of Crimea. That was the starting point of the war. And no one can doubt it, you know, and no one is trying even to doubt it, you know, aside of some countries like Syria who supports, and with Assad regime supporting Russia. And even those countries who would like to overcome this, they cannot, because it's the fact. And nobody is interested in canceling the UN Charter, because that would mean the total chaos that world will fall in. So therefore, in this or other way, even if there are some, you know, bargaining and some trade, et cetera, with Russia, I think that it's inevitable that we will come to the point where the whole world would support Ukraine. But of course, in this sense, we would need more support from our allies, who can provide us with more weapons, just for the whole world feels that Ukraine is winner. And that's how we get even more support, because everyone wants to support those who is winning the war.
Yeah, sure.
That's the truth.
I hope that the informational field is quite clear about the situation on the Crimean Peninsula, and on the 9th year of the war in Ukraine, there's less and less doubt among the countries that are far away from Ukraine in the real situation on the Crimean Peninsula. We'll talk about it a little later, but now I want to ask you about the main points that we discuss each year. For example, the declarations after the summit took place. Each year we talk about this. But on the other hand, we understand that there are I would say public and not public activities. So this is public activities, as long as the office activities, representation, co-working and so on. But what's left behind the curtains? Can you tell us more detail what's going on between summits in August since 2020?
Mm-hmm. Indeed, summits are very bright spots, I would say, when it comes to the history of the Crimea Platform initiative, but that's not the only one thing that happens. So first of all, after the first Crimea Platform summit in 2021, the Office of the Crimea Platform was established by the order of the President of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky, and that's the institution that I represent here. And I think that some of the work that we've been doing will be reflected, and actually was reflected already within the third Crimea Platform Summit. And this work is related to developing the strategies on the reintegration of Crimea. That sounds maybe complicated, but what it means is that we're getting prepared to the next day after the deoccupation of Crimea. And I should say that may sound paradoxically, but I should say that there are now much more people who see the occupation of Crimea as something that might happen soon. There are much more people who believe in that it was prior to the full-scale invasion of Russia, or I would say prior to the very brave resistance to this full-scale invasion. So now, I mean, I understand that Crimea is overshadowed by the other events going on the mainland Ukraine, but still Crimea is much more in the news, is being discussed in the international media, like in other countries, etc. So that's why we're getting prepared to the occupation. And there are tons and tons of issues that we need to resolve once Crimea is deoccupied. So how do we administer that territory right after the deoccupation? So Crimea has been occupied for 10 years. This case is much more complicated than other territories that might have been occupied for like 1 year or 1.5 years, etc. And we know that there are lots of problems in the deoccupied territories. In Crimea, we will have even more problems. The problem of colonization that I mentioned, it means that not less than 500,000 of Russian citizens were transferred to Crimea illegally, and they stayed there illegally. And we have somehow to resolve this issue, because we cannot let them stay in Crimea because they stay there illegally. So we have to somehow resolve this issue. We have to resolve tons of issues, like with the private property, with the court cases, with the court decisions that were issued by the occupying courts. So there's a bunch of issues that we try to resolve, and we drafted the strategy jointly with the experts. So how do we deal with all those issues? But on the other side, and that is the priority for Volodymyr Zelensky actually, is that we need to, and we already have developed the vision of the future of Crimea. So, meaning that we have to show to our citizens in Crimea who stayed there, but also those who fled as IDPs or refugees, how the future of Crimea will look like. So how Crimea will look like, because honestly, nobody wants to go back to Crimea of 2013. Honestly, that wasn't like the super successful story. So we want to create something new, something open to the world, something connected to mainland Ukraine, but also to the civilized world. Not with a carriage bridge connected to Russia, but with something connected to the European countries, to the Mediterranean. Crimea has, throughout its history, before the Russian occupation, before Russia annexed Crimea for the first time, it was really like a melting pot of the Black Sea region. it was super connected to Mediterranean, with Italians being there, you know, with like other nations being there, with the Greek culture that was there. Chersonesos is a famous place where you can see this Greek. So it was a part in Mediterranean. It was a part of the something that we might call global south now, with its connection to Turkey and with the Crimean Tatar Khanate that existed there for more than 300 years, actually. So, and we need to bring back there this spirit of diversity, of multiculture, and of indigenous peoples, of course, because Crimean Tatars cannot live there now. So now we try to build this vision of the future of Crimea, and you know, it's like, it might sound too theoretic, but I should say, when you see, for instance, these projects that we aim to create there jointly with other state institutions like Ministry of Reconstruction, right? Mr. Kubrakov and his team, Mr. Fedorov and his team. So we see these pictures like literally constructed in the virtual world, but that show how Crimea will look like. And it looks absolutely fabulous. And I think that will be super attractive, not only for Ukrainians, for our citizens, but also for international investments. And by the way, that was already a part of the Crimea Platform Summit. So we try to work more with businesses, with local Crimean businesses who had to relocate after the beginning of the occupation, with international businesses. They need to really feel that Ukraine is serious when we're talking about the deoccupation and reintegration of Crimea. So it's not something theoretical that we discuss once a year or twice a year in the summits of Crimea Platform, but that is the day-to-day work that Ukraine is doing while constructing this vision of the future of Crimea.
If we talk about the details of deoccupation and reintegration Crimea, even now, I want to dig deeper. Several very important points. What you said about the current situation of way of living in the Crimea Peninsula, because we understand that since 2014, these people have been living under the Russian legal system, under the Russian educational system, medical care system, administration. There are lots of real estate and businesses that were captured, that were rewritten, relocated, as you said. So we understand the global issue of each social problem that we have to deal after deoccupation. That's the first point, the deoccupation. So now you say that there are plans in each field of social life, and it has been in work right now. I mean, only by Ukrainian government, or these participants of Crimean Platform take part in creating these plans, and how they do it? I mean, what actually they do, each country, to help in this?
So currently it's the domestic level, so, right? And actually it's Ukrainian business how do we reintegrate Crimea in the first place. Of course, we would need support of our allies in terms of resources, in terms of expertise in various fields. And I mean, now there are various projects that helps Ukraine to rebuild some of the liberated areas, and we definitely will use that experience. But now those principles, I would say at the level of principles, that is something that has to be decided inside Ukraine. And that is understanding that we have also from our international allies. Ukraine says that, of course, we need to adhere to the principles of the international law. We're not going to behave like Russia when dealing with our people and with the liberated territories. But there are those like issues that we need to resolve by ourselves. So how do we deal with the judiciary system? How do we, whether we establish the military administration or military civil administration? When are we going to conduct elections there? It's one of the complicated issues, et cetera, et cetera. But I mean, I definitely think that Crimean Platform in the future, after the deoccupation of Crimea, can serve as an international hub in order to unite the resources of our allies, precisely to help Crimea, to help us to rebuild Crimea. So that's important. And something that was presented in the current year, that's division, because for us it's still important. Of course, we decided by ourselves how do we reintegrate Crimea, but we still have to transfer this vision to our partners, obviously. That's an important thing for us to show them. And of course, in the future, it's important because we want, and that's the will of President of Ukraine, to engage potential big international companies, large players, right now, to sign memorandums of understanding with them for the future, that in the future those companies are interested in working in Crimea, that they're ready to come there, like big hotel like networks and et cetera, so that's part of the strategy, also to show to our citizens in Crimea that yes, you will have like a job to do, like after Ukraine deoccupy Crimea, because of course Russia pays lots of attention and lots of effort, puts lots of efforts in order to promote this false idea that if Ukraine goes back to Crimea, that will be a disaster, there will be, ethnic cleansing or whatever. They are really masters in spreading the lies, we know that. So that's an important thing to overcome these lies and to show to our citizens that Crimea, like Ukraine will bring not just peace to Crimea, but prosperity.
People, this is very difficult and emotional question right now about people. I want to divide it in 2 points. First one, it's the generation that was born and raised under the occupation and under the propaganda and under the rising of maybe hatred towards Ukraine and all Ukrainian. And the other, it's the people who've been living under the Russian passports by their will or by the circumstances, but we understand it's a fact. So these 2 groups might be quite threatening to the statehood of Ukraine after the occupation. How to deal with these groups of people? Is there any plan about this group of people, how to communicate with them, how to deal with them? Will it be some kind of unified version as with Donetsk and Lugansk regions? And the other question is, what should be the status of Crimea after the occupation and reintegration for not given a chance to use the situation again and to destabilize this region by Russians, whoever?
That's lots of questions.
Lots of questions. Three in one, let's say.
Yes, exactly. So
kids.
So when it comes to, so first of all, of course, the part of our strategy is something that we call the strategy of the occupation of minds or cognitive deoccupation. Yep. And I would say that it's a separate, huge chapter, and those group of people that you've mentioned, it's not the only one potential maybe problem, right? But I would say again that when we try to estimate the state of minds of people in the occupation, it's not so easy because we can assume that some people might have this position, but we don't have this information. We don't have any polls, and we cannot have any polls from the occupied territory. We understand that within these 10 years, we have no idea what is in the minds of people. Of course, we can guess that propaganda is really heavy, that there are lots of Russian citizens who come there, but still. And I would like, just to bring a counter argument, because since the beginning of the full-scale invasion, we have seen even not even dozens, but hundreds of actions in support of mainland Ukraine inside Crimea. So people who live under the occupation, they understand that it's a threat for them, and they are brought to responsibility for that, but still they're signaling their support to mainland Ukraine. With whatever tools they have. It might be blue and yellow nails, and people got persecuted for that. Can you imagine that? It might be Molotov cocktails thrown in the occupying administration. So these are various tools, very peaceful and quite radical, as it might seem. But you have like hundreds of people ready to risk themselves. We call this sociology, like that is available to us. We can see that there are really lots of people who are ready to support Ukraine who wear vyshivankas or sing Червона Калина, and they got persecuted for that. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's like Orwell, of course, but and sometimes these cases might be funny if they were not so dramatic, because once you get on the spot of the security service of Russia in the occupation, it's like you will be followed and you cannot do any move and not get persecuted. So I would say that it's quite complicated now to make any assumptions, but still we understand that the problems that we're going to face are huge. And it's, by the way, not only consequences of the current occupation. Russia has been working in Crimea, even prior to that. And we know that they were like brainwashing people. They were selling this idea of Russia being a powerful state, blah, blah, blah. And we can also see, because we're communicating with Crimea all the time, I should say, and that's absolutely a priority for us. Lots of my colleagues have some relatives there, or we just have some, friends and contacts there. And we can see, by the way, how those explosions that happened in Crimea since October of the previous year, when, the Kerch Bridge was affected by one of the explosions, and now there's lots of these explosions. So this image of Russia being powerful, being so military important and so on, and lots of people buy into this. Those who miss this, USSR nostalgia and so on. So those who bought into it, they got disappointed. And these are the people that potentially, even though they might be supportive of Russian occupation, they're no more, because they cannot feel the strength behind Moscow anymore. So I would say that it's so complicated. But of course, whether we have to work with the children, yes, but I should say that we can see how Ukraine becomes trendy among youth in Crimea. Because Russia is about some, in the end of the day, it's about repressions. You cannot go online to the internet, those websites that you like to, it's the censorship. But of course, I cannot deny that it's a huge number of issues that we have to work with, educational process, like cultural space, because Russia just flooded everything with those imperial signs, Soviet signs, with those little green men, the monuments to the little green man, and they spoiled and dismantled some of Ukrainian, Crimean Tatar identity, I would say emblematic cultural, architectural objects that they just stolen many important things from Crimean museums, and just kidnapped them, stolen them, looted them, like as Moscow did in the previous centuries. And as for the status of Crimea, yes, just to give a brief answer. So now, if we're talking about some changes in the status of Crimea, that would require changes in the constitution of Ukraine. That's not the case now because of the martial law, so we cannot make any changes into the constitution. And this is a complicated issue. I will not, pretend that it's, and it is something that needs to be discussed. But I would just like to say, because I think it's really, really important, just as a citizen of Ukraine, that because when we're talking about the status, we can consider several options, like the status quo with the Autonomous Republic of Crimea and the city of Sevastopol, potentially the Crimea turning into just oblast, like as any single oblast of Ukraine, and the Crimean Tatar autonomy, right? So that's one of the options that being considered. And I think that oftentimes people just got confused, thinking that if there will be Crimean Tatar autonomy, that would threaten the territorial integrity of Ukraine again. And because I just think that this is not the proper and correct comparison, because the Autonomous Republic of Crimea that was and is in the Ukrainian constitution, that was an autonomy that allowed Russia, that was autonomy designed for Russia.
Yeah, absolutely. That's why I'm asking what should be changed in this.
Yes, but I mean, when it comes to the Crimean Tatar autonomy, I wouldn't think that it's something threatful. That's my opinion as a citizen of Ukraine. I would like to underline this, but I think it's important to underline.
So in this place, we will stop a little bit because I want to add, we will continue to talk about security matters on the peninsula, but now I want to add the opinion of the representative of the country that is participant of Crimean Platform, is Lithuania. And I'm glad to present one more guest. It's the head of Committee of International Affairs of the Seimas of Lithuania. It's Žygimantas Pavilionis. Hello.
Pleasure. Hello.
Yeah. Thank you very much for your time for our program. And I would like to start our conversation with you with some additional information with which I would like to start the discussion. So the Grand Chamber of the European Courts of Human Rights declared partially admissible the complaint about systematic violations of human rights in Crimea filed by Ukraine against Russia. The court agreed with Kyiv's version that the peninsula came under the de facto control of Russia even before the referendum on February 27th of 2014. The dispute about political repression and persecution of opponents of the annexation of Crimea and Russia's responsibility for this will now be considered on the merits. But despite all these facts, despite all the decisions, Russia continues to deny any accusation. And moreover, Russia is not a state party to the International Criminal Court. She signed the Rome Statute on September 13, 2000, but never ratified it. And in 2016, shortly after the release of the reports on the preliminary investigations into events in Ukraine, Russia abandoned its membership in this court. So my question is, all these decisions of the court right now, from your point of view of the representative of European country, how it will help us in the question of Crimea? On example that what happened with Abkhazia and Samochablo in Georgia after all the decisions of court.
Well, the problem with Russia is that it is revisionist power, and they would like to reverse international order created by our grandfathers after Second World War and create their own concentration camps together with communist Chinese. This is the fight against an international order, against democracies, and the attempt to install kind of autocratic world driven by Russians and Chinese and other autocracies, smaller one. So for me, I see the only way for Ukraine to guarantee its territorial integrity and sovereignty to join EU and NATO as soon as possible. Unfortunately, today, international law is not able to guarantee that aggressors like Russia is not violating it. And only two organizations on this planet, as I see today, can guarantee it: EU together with NATO. And that's why, at least in Lithuanian parliament, in all the resolutions, and another resolution that we're drafting right now, maybe in September it will be adopted in the plenary, we call for swift, not only start of accession talks for Ukrainian entry into EU, but for clear and formal invitation for Ukraine to join NATO in next Washington NATO summit. We made some steps in Vilnius for you, but not enough. It's just one step left towards invitation. You don't need membership action plan. You are the only country that don't need it. Your progress is visible, but we need to convince all NATO members that you need invitation. And only Article 5, only our collective security can guarantee that those orcs will never invade you, will never kill your kids, will never kill your citizen, and will never destroy your towns. This is unfortunately the reality of us living in this region.
Let's talk about the security of the region as a whole, not about Ukraine, considering the maritime borders with Russia near neighboring countries such as Moldova, Romania, Georgia, Turkey, Bulgaria. and Russia's almost, I would say, piracy behavior within the framework of international maritime law. So what threats do European Union see in relation to these countries from the territory of the occupied Crimea?
Well, from experience of the Baltic states, we all know just one historical lesson. Russians will never treat you normally until you join elite clubs of the West. You know, Baltic states for Russia was nothing, just territory to occupy. But we did it. We deleted those gray zones from the map that do not attract violence. And from the moment Europeans made it very clear that Baltic states will become members of European Union and later NATO, Russia started to respect us, to shake our hands, to meet with us. So it was the mistake of the West in Bucharest NATO summit in 2008 that we created the gray zone because we kneeled and we accepted the logic of Russia that enlargement provokes the war. No. From the Baltic experience, we know that NATO enlargement guarantees peace. And next year it will be 75 years of NATO that guaranteed peace for 75 years on its territory. So I see no other chance just to delete those gray zones, just to, with countries like Moldova to start accession talks. But honestly, I do not believe that this will be just EU membership. Experience of Central and Baltic states showed that we first joined NATO and after EU, or like in Baltic states case, we joined it in parallel. There is no other scenario when you live with aggressive regimes like Russia. You can construct wonderful house with the EU, have a great kitchen there, but if orcs are coming and destroying your walls, you have to build the iron fence for them.
Yes, understandable. I want to add the opinion of Maria. Maria, in the frames of Crimea Platform, what's in an international aspect, what the extent is the occupied Crimea is a threat to neighboring countries, especially of European Union? And is this item discussed during the summits, during all these 3 times? Already?
I think obviously, Ambassador, nice to see you. So actually, of course, that is one of the key issues that is being discussed. And I think it's something that is especially actual for the countries of the Black Sea region, that is understandable for our neighbors that we have nearby, like Turkey, for instance, or Romania or Bulgaria. So that is something that is more understandable for them. But now I think that it might be perceived not only literally as Crimea as a threat, being Russian naval and military base, also because of the fact that Russia attacked Ukraine in the previous year. This full-scale invasion happened also from the territory of Crimea. So, because Russia turned Crimea into a military base. So obviously this military and security factor is one of the key things that being discussed during the summit.
Žygimantas, I want to ask you about the situation in the Black Sea area. I mean, the maritime law and legal aspects that is broken more often by Russian Federation. And this is aspect, how it discussed in European Union and how it can be solved to make Black Sea safe territory for civil navigation as well.
Well, it's not only Black Sea. I would now come back maybe to war against Georgia in 2008. The problem is that if we as a West or international community allow Russia to violate all possible international laws, all possible, not only maritime, Helsinki Accords, OSCE, Council of Europe, you name me any international law that is not broken by Russia. But if we continue show appeasement, like the West stupidly showed appeasement to Hitler during Munich Accords, if you feed the tiger, if you give them, Putin was not punished for occupation of Georgia at all. Instead, he was embraced. And I was already screaming then in Brussels, and then I was posted like ambassador to Washington. I said, this is the most stupid policy what you do after occupation embracing Russian regime. So if it repeats itself in Crimea, if this is another piece of territory that we give to Putin, so be sure that we are next. And that's what we feel in the Baltics, that's what we feel in Poland, and all the neighbors of Ukraine feel it. If international community is just swallowing it like they did it with Georgian territories, well, not formally, but politically, then this war is imminent with NATO. And this will turn into complete war on, Third World War, if you want, and not only in our region. As I mentioned, China, I'm just from Taiwan with all three Baltic shares. Emperor Xi also decided to occupy Taiwan, and he's now carefully looking what's happening in Ukraine. If Russia wins as he wants, he might occupy Taiwan Straits, and this is 80% of international trade. Then the world will go into chaos. That's why we tell to our brothers and sisters in Washington, London, Paris, and Berlin, you cannot do it in Ukraine. You cannot seize any territories. It should be Ukraine with all its parts, as in constitution, to win that war. Because if we do that mistake, like we did with Hitler once, we were occupied. Also, Baltic states disappeared from the map of this world for 50 years because of those mistakes. We know it, and our historic experience is telling no more. That's why Ukrainian war is our war. This should be understood by all democracies on this planet. If you win, democracy wins, international law wins, and we can restore this rule-based order at a global level. If you lose, we lose. Freedom and democracy at the global level loses. And then we will have concentration camps built by those autocracies. And everybody will suffer. Everybody, not only Ukrainians and Lithuanians.
At the end of our discussion with you, I want to remember your words at the beginning of full-scale invasion of Ukraine, that you said in one of the interviews. You said that Russia looks like a gnome, although it has a large territory. So my question is, yes, maybe looks like a gnome, but still for the international community, some of the countries a little bit or quite afraid of all the threats that's pronounced by the Kremlin speakers, including nuclear weapon using not only on the territory of Ukraine, but even in European countries and so on. So what threatens more the European ally? The nuclear war or the spread of Russia and the status of chaos on this huge, huge territory in the middle of the continent?
Well, I think Putin kind of created miracle because he united us as never before. I'm doing this business for maybe 30 years on this planet, like diplomat and politician. Never before I felt Europe of the East and West, South and North so united on Ukraine. I will soon travel to Kyiv with a lot of members of parliament of different countries, and we feel united. They all speak like me, those French, those Germans, those Brits, those Spanish. So now our task, and what is our conclusion after Vilnius summit, is to win the hearts of Americans. America is going to huge elections that might determine not only the historic, future of America, but of our region as well. So we talk with your ambassador, with your community in America, with all other immigrant communities, with think tanks and congressmen. Those elections will be very important for Ukraine. So we should speak with the left and with the right. We have to unite America on Ukraine. We did it for ourselves. Nobody wanted us also in Washington. And we found great friends as late Senator McCain, and we are finding them now for you. So after this trip to Kyiv, we will go many times to Washington, D.C., to Chicago, to Los Angeles, to New York. We will be your voice. We will try to convince that there is no other way, just the way of Central European and Baltic states. Can you imagine, President Havel, our all leaders, they were coming to Washington, D.C. like this and speaking with Bill Clinton and saying to you, Bill, President, you have a choice. Either we are becoming gray zone and Russia starts the conflicts with NATO, or you are enlarging NATO to first freed Central European states, then to the rest. It was very difficult to convince Bill Clinton. It was also not easy to convince President Bush, who came to Vilnius in 2002, and I still remember when he said those magical words, from this moment, every enemy of Lithuania is the enemy of United States of America. We put those walls in the old city, and we read them every day. So I pray for the moment President Biden is saying those words for Ukraine, and I think we can do it. We have to do it because your fight is our fight. Your fight is a fight of global democracy today.
Thank you very much for your sharp position, and thank you very much for your time for our program. This was head of the Committee on International Affairs of the Seimas of Lithuania, Žygimantas Pavilionis. Thank you very much. And we are getting back to our studio. Maria, I want to ask you, actually, it's your opinion too. I read it in one of your interviews as well. So experts notice, as you do, that some of the top international, sometimes even top international media, still have not clear position to the categorizing of some frameworks. For example, still calling the separatist groups in relation to Russian killers and Russian soldiers, whatever, that's from 2014 and here. And it's interesting for me because from the very beginning of full-scale invasion, we have here thousands of international journalists, thousands of people who can, by their own eyes, see the real situation, talk to the evidences of the events of the annexation of Crimea here in Ukraine, and tell the truth to the world. Why it's so still?
It's a huge problem. It deserves probably a separate conversation because Russia really managed to meddle so much into these discussions and understanding of even our allies about both Crimea and eastern Ukraine that was previously occupied after 2014. So, and especially when it comes to Crimea, I would like to quote one of the brilliant articles that was written by our academia representatives when they were analyzing this representation of Crimean issue into the international discussions. So they provided this vibe that you can feel even when you talk to our allies or even to the diplomats that are supporting territorial integrity of Ukraine. So lots of people, because of Russian lies, think that the occupation of Crimea was illegal but fair, Mm-hmm. These myths about Crimea has always been Russian. They are planted so much into the minds of so many people. You can just not to go too far. You can look at the recent interview of Barack Obama to the famous journalist CNN Ksenia Smirnova, when he said, in 2014 there were lots of Russian-speaking population in Crimea, therefore we did not react properly. I don't know even how to comment it, because it's absolutely in line with Russian propaganda messages. And it has nothing to do with the real situation that was also reflected in the decision of the European Court that you quoted here. I mean, European Court essentially said that it was a military operation aimed at the occupation of Crimea, and that was happened. There was no referendum, no this, all this stuff about Russian-speaking population. It has nothing to do with this military seizure of Crimea that happened in 2014. So, or Elon Musk, who tweeted about the Khrushchev and who kind of unfairly gave Crimea to Ukraine. So we have all bunch of these Russian issued lies or Russian supported lies that lives for decades about Crimea. And that's what we're fighting with, you know. It's not only this military occupation, is this mindset that we're dealing with. You know, I don't want even to go to the issues of Eastern Ukraine because it's like a separate conversation. But even when it comes to Crimea, my humble opinion is that this lies that is planted in minds of people sometimes intervenes even into the decision-making process, you know. Some even diplomats, I don't want to refer to anyone like very precisely, but sometimes people like, I feel that they believe in that lies, like, you know, that Crimea was Russian for years, isn't it true? Crimea was colonized by Russia. There were no Russians in Crimea before the colonization. Unfortunately, indigenous peoples cannot live in Crimea controlled by Russia. So, I mean, if you are anti-colonial, and our Western allies obviously anti-colonial, either you support these lies or you support the democracy.
Isn't it ironic that in the 21st century, when we have all the abilities, technical, to read and see the truth, we have intelligence services of high quality that's are shown in Hollywood movies and so on. We have historians and open materials in easy access in our hands, but still we have even professors that give lessons in international universities and other institutions to students, to high officials about grounding on this manipulated or erased history by Russia. Why is so, and how influential or how potential the participants of this Crimean platform to influence their officials in their countries, their expert environments in their countries, their audience in their countries after these summits in Ukraine?
I think that somehow what influences this very complicated situation indeed. I have no very straightforward and plain answer. Why is it so? I mean, it's because we're still dealing with the dissolution of this Russian empire, which is in the process. But after the beginning of the full-scale invasion, that showed so clear that many intelligence services of various powerful countries, that various academic stars, they were wrong about Russia and Russian plans on Ukraine. Even like lots of us were wrong, you know, not even to mention those academia stars. But full-scale invasion opened the eyes of many people and made them reconsider their attitude and their vision of Ukraine, not only Crimea. And of course, Crimea Platform is part of this process. And it helps us, of course, because those top officials that come to Kyiv or to other capitals where Crimea Platform summits are taking place, they come there and they show this commitment of these countries to support Ukrainian territorial integrity. They talk about Crimea, they communicate with representatives of Ukrainian state, with representatives of the export network of the Crimea Platform. That's why we also try to fuel those summits, not only with just political statements, but with discussions, you know, to bring experts, to bring more understanding of this context. It may sound, you know, very boring, but you cannot feel this need of territorial integrity of Ukraine and that it is really fair if you don't get this whole picture of what is history of Crimea, what is the history of people in Crimea, living in Crimea. Who are Crimean Tatars? They did not came there from the, you know, mountains in Asia. They were formed there for centuries from various peoples living there. And the fact that these people cannot live there is absolutely undermining this Russian imperial rhetorics.
And actually not the first time in their history.
Absolutely. So, and that's why, by the way, I would like to just emphasize this because it's really important. The recent report issued by Dunya Mijatovic, the Commissioner on Human Rights of the Council of Europe, this report on Crimean Tatars and human rights in Crimea, it starts, I was amazed by this, it starts with the 18th century, where Crimea was first annexed by Russia. And that is the moment when these violations against precisely Crimean Tatars started. And I mean, you cannot see things like that previously from the European bureaucrats, they didn't like to talk about, that wasn't trendy. But now, I'm thankful to Ms. Mijatovic because she realized that you have to start this conversation there in order to get people understand what indeed is going on in Crimea, and that we cannot pretend that Russian-speaking population is a fair reason not to help Ukraine to defend our territorial integrity. That just means that you support Russian propaganda lies. That's it.
And unfortunately, we have just a few minutes of our conversation with you, and I want to finalize our discussion with your words. You once said that Crimea is the needle of the immortal Koshay. Koshay is a fairy tale hero. It's an evil in Russian fairy tales. And I want to ask you how to destroy this Koshay with this needle, because in the fairy tale, you have to break the needle to destroy Koshay. So how we can destroy Koshay without breaking the needle, the Crimea? And what sanctions and what instruments are discussed on the platform in the case if this Koshay, Putin, will threaten not only Ukraine, but all the neighboring countries around Black Sea?
Yes, I would say, first of all, that Koshay is not only Putin, but unfortunately all those Russian people who support this war. So it's not Putin's war. I support the idea that it's not Putin's war. It's war of Russians against Ukraine and Ukrainians. I think that, my answer might seem not too intellectual, but I think that the truth, this needle can be broken by providing Ukraine sufficient military support. So, of course, Crimea Platform is about diplomacy, but that was established at the point when Ukraine still felt like we can still fix things by talking, Now, there's no illusion. We understand that we need to get weapons. Ukraine didn't yet, as far as I know, got weapons that might help us to liberate Crimea. So let's be clear. And that's why we also say that probably our Western allies do not yet believe that Crimea indeed should go back under the Ukrainian control. So probably that's one of the reasons. That's why it can be broken, I think, by the weapons and by the further political support, also for the reintegration of Crimea. Because while we're working on those strategies, we really understand that it's not only about the occupation, which will be done by our brave and brilliant armed forces of Ukraine. But then you have step number 2, which is really complicated, with reintegration of Crimea. And that's a huge task for Ukraine and further.
I understand that we have a lot of topics to discuss, yet we unfortunately don't have time for this, but we have to do it right now because it's the future of international law in the frames of deliberating Crimea and returning to the legal field of Ukraine state. And this is the future of the world order, the democratic normal order. Hopefully we will discuss it in time. Thank you very much for this interview and for this discussion. So I want to remind our audience that my guest today is Maria Tomac, the head of the Crimean Platform Support Service, with whom we discussed the main points of the Crimean Platform and the future of Crimean Peninsula. So I'm Ksenia Smirnova, and this was my show, Talk for More Details. So if you liked this episode, so press like button. If you didn't like it, write in the comments why. And press the bell, of course, to be the first to see the most up-to-date information. And don't forget to subscribe to the Gaze platform on YouTube and our other social networks. Thank you for your attention, thank you for your time, and keep in touch.